Red Hollow was not a town so much as a pause in the dust. It was a scattering of buildings huddled in a dry valley of the territory, a vast, sun-baked expanse that mapmakers in the East were still arguing over. The year was somewhere in the 1870s, perhaps sliding into the 1880s. But the calendar mattered less than the heat. Summer in the high desert was not a season, it was an affliction. The sun did not rise gently. It struck the land like a hammer, and by midday, the air shimmered as if the world were melting at the edges. Evenings brought no real relief. The sun would finally bleed out, staining the western sky a deep, angry color. The shade of rust on an old plow blade. The wind would pick up, tasting of grit and distance, carrying the scent of dry grass and the faint, lonely cry of a hawk. Ian Thorne's ranch sat apart from the main cluster of buildings, nestled in a shallow dip of the land as if seeking shelter. It was a place of solitude, defined by the man who worked it. The house was built of thick logs, chinked with mud and persistence. The barn stood nearby, its wood weathered to a soft, silver gray. The fences were old, but the posts were set deep and the rails were sound. Ian Thorne was a man who mended things to last. His well was shallow, dangerously so in this long drought, and the rope for the bucket was worn thin in one spot. Inside the two-room house, the air held the permanent, layered sense of a man living alone. Old smoke, bacon fat, oiled leather, and the sharp tang of lye soap. A dark scar ran along the heavy ceiling rafter above the main room. It was a smooth, blackened streak, a memory of fire, a place where flames had licked the pine before being beaten into submission. Ian never looked directly at it, but he was aware of it, always, just as he was aware of the ache in his left knee on cold mornings. His life was built on a foundation of relentless rhythm. Ian rose before the first hint of gray light, his movements economical and quiet. He was a broad-shouldered man, with a frame built for the heavy work of breaking sod and lifting timber. But the years, and the grief he carried, had carved hollows under his eyes and etched deep lines from his nose to the corners of his mouth. His eyes were the color of the sky just before the sun went down, a faded blue-gray, and they held a profound, settled sadness. He was a widower. The fire that had scarred the rafter had taken everything else. The ranch was his only companion, and it was a demanding one. The silence of the place was broken only by the sounds he made, the rhythmic squeak and clank of the well pump, the dry whisper of hay falling into the manger, the sharp, clean split of an axe biting into juniper wood. He spoke little, not even to his mule or the half-dozen chickens that scratched in the yard. Words felt like a waste, an indulgence he had long since given up. He lived in his body, in the pull of his muscles and the sharp bite of sweat in his eyes. Far from the Thorne Ranch, on the other side of Red Hollow, Iris Vale watched the same rust-colored sunset through a crack in a shed wall. She was 19 years old, though she felt much older. The hardship of her life had worn away any softness, leaving a quiet, watchful resilience. She was small, but the endless labor demanded of her had strengthened her arms and calloused her hands until they were rough as corn husks. She lived under the roof and the thumb of Clyde Marin, a man she had been told to call uncle, though he was no blood relation she knew of. Clyde was a man of slippery words and quick, unpleasant smiles. He had taken her in, or so he claimed, when her mother passed, and he never let her forget the debt. Her life was a repeating cycle of heavy tasks, hauling water from a muddy creek, scrubbing floors with harsh soap that cracked her skin, mending clothes she did not wear, and tending a garden whose vegetables she rarely tasted. She had learned that silence was her only armor. She kept her eyes down, her mouth shut, and her thoughts locked away. She had not laughed, not a real laugh. In so many years she could no longer recall the sound of it. She knew nothing of Ian Thorne or his lonely ranch. Her world was defined by the smell of chicken feed, the sting of wood smoke in her eyes, and the constant, dull ache of fear. The town of Red Hollow itself was little more than a single, wide street, its dust ground to a fine powder by wagon wheels and the hooves of tired horses. There was a saloon, the Horseshoe, its bat-wing doors swinging open to release the sounds of a tinny piano and rough laughter. Across the street stood the general store, its shelves sparsely stocked with flour, salt, coffee, and bolts of plain cloth. A man with a heavy thumb and a suspicious gaze ran it. Further down, at the edge of the cluster, was a small, whitewashed chapel. Its steeple seemed undersized, as if it were apologizing for reaching toward the massive, indifferent sky. This was the domain of Reverend Cole Avery. He was a tall, lean man who wore the black coat of a preacher, but also the silver star of a sheriff. In the territory, the law of God and the law of man often had to be enforced by the same hand. He preached on Sundays, pulling lessons from the harshness of the land, and the rest of the week he kept the peace, settling disputes that ranged from stolen livestock to drunken brawls. He was a fair man, but a tired one. Not far from the town, in a small cabin near the only reliable creek, lived Mara Doone. She was a woman who straddled the line between the town and the wild land. She was a healer, a midwife, a woman who knew the secrets of willow bark and comfrey root. She had seen most of Red Hollow's residents into the world and had eased the passing of just as many. She was sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and missed nothing. She watched the comings and goings of the valley with a practical, unsentimental gaze. These were the souls anchored to Red Hollow, each living with their own ghosts. For Ian Thorne, the ghosts were tangible. He finished his evening chores as the last light faded from the sky. He moved into the barn, the air warm and sweet with the scent of hay and the mild, dusty smell of his mule. He latched the door, his movements sure in the gathering dark. In a far corner, hidden behind a stack of old harnesses and burlap sacks, his hand brushed against a small, forgotten object. He did not need to see it to know its shape. It was a small wooden horse, crudely carved, its legs uneven, one side of it, and the small rocker it was fixed to, was blackened and charred. The wood burned smooth. It was the only thing he had pulled from the ashes. Ian's broad chest tightened. The burned rafter in the house was a scar. This small, broken toy was an open wound. It was the last thing his son's hands had touched. The fire had taken his wife, Sarah, and his boy, little Eli. It had happened 3 years ago, but time had not softened the memory. It had only made it sharper, like a piece of glass he carried in his pocket. He could not bring himself to throw the toy away, nor could he bear to look at it. He left it there, a nail of memory driven deep into the shadows of the barn. He stepped back out into the yard. The night was vast, the stars so bright they seemed to leak light. This was a land of extremes. Life was brittle, a drought, a blizzard, a sudden fire, or a misplaced bullet could end everything. And in a place so empty, the rules of the world back east felt thin, like worn cloth. Here, family lines and legal papers were often just tools, weapons used to control. A woman, especially a young one with no one to stand for her, was a commodity. Her value was something to be haggled over, like a sack of grain or a head of cattle. Men like Clyde Marin understood this marketplace well. Ian Thorne knew nothing of this. He knew only his grief and the demands of his land. He stood by the old fence, the dry wind pulling at his shirt, and listened. The world was silent, but in the distance, miles off, a sound began to separate itself from the night. It was the steady, rhythmic beat of hoofbeats. It was the sound of horses, moving at a steady pace, not wandering, but traveling with purpose, headed his way. He frowned, his gaze turning toward the dark road that led to his gate. Visitors were rare. Visitors at this hour were almost unknown. He did not move. He simply waited, a solid, quiet shape in the starlight. The air was still, that deep, breathless quiet that comes before a storm. The hoofbeats grew louder, a drumming rhythm against the dry earth, closing the distance. Ian Thorne felt the old, familiar tightening in his gut. The instinct of a man who had learned that whatever the wilderness brought to your door, it seldom brought good news. The sound was the pulse of the coming trouble, the first drops of a rain that would change everything. The sound resolved into two horses. Ian Thorne stood motionless by the fence, his body a stiff, watchful line in the faint starlight. The shapes approached the gate. One rider was slight, vibrating with a nervous energy. The other figure was smaller, draped in shadow, and rode slumped on a tired-looking nag. Clyde Marin swung down from the lead horse before it had fully stopped. He was a small man with a squeezed face and eyes set too close together. He smiled, a quick, unpleasant stretch of his lips. He announced his name as Clyde Marin, that he was just passing through, and that he had a piece of business for Ian. He gestured to the horse he had been riding. It was a fine animal, a dark-coated mare with strong lines and a steady gaze. Even in the poor light, Ian could see the quality. The mare stood quietly, but her ears swiveled, tasting the air of the new place. And Clyde began his sales pitch. His voice slick and fast, he spoke of the mare's speed, her endurance, her gentle temper. He said she was a prize, a true treasure of a horse. He called her Lark. Ian's blood turned to ice. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the mare. He did not need the light. He knew the shape of this horse. He knew the small white star on her forehead. He had bought this horse 9 years ago. It was Lark. It had been Sarah's horse, his wife's horse. The world tilted. He had sold her after the fire, sold her to a good man, a farmer heading back east to Pennsylvania. He had sold her because he could not bear to look at her, could not bear the sight of the empty saddle, the memory of his wife's hands on her reins. His voice was a low rasp, barely human. He asked where Clyde got the horse. Clyde waved a dismissive hand, as if brushing off a fly. He claimed he won her in a card game, a lucky turnover in the next territory. He said he had heard Ian Thorne was a man who knew good horseflesh and might be in the market. Ian stared at the mare. She tossed her head, a familiar, impatient gesture. He felt the past rise up like bile in his throat. To see her here, at his gate, brought by this weasel of a man, it was a desecration. Clyde misread the frozen silence. He thought he had his hook set. He said he was not looking for money. He was a man with a problem, and Ian was his solution. He jerked his thumb back toward the second rider, the small figure who had not moved. The girl. Too, Clyde explained his situation. He was moving on, heading for the goldfields up north, or maybe south to Mexico. He could not be burdened with excess baggage. He pointed at the girl, who sat limp on the sad-looking horse. He called her his niece, his ward, Iris Vale. He said she was 19, strong, healthy. He listed her virtues as if she were a mule. She could cook, she could clean, she could mend, she could tend a garden, a hard worker. He promised, though a bit sullen. Ian said nothing. His mind was trying to make sense of the scene. The horse, the girl, the lies. Clyde laid out his terms, his voice casual, as if discussing the price of flour. He would trade, a straight trade, the mare, Lark, this magnificent horse, for the girl. The words hung in the dry, dead air. They settled on Ian like alkali dust, corrosive and choking. The man was offering to trade a human being for a horse that was, by some past right, already tied to this land. Clyde grew impatient with the silence. He thought Ian was bargaining. He said, "Look, she is a burden. She eats. I just need to be free of her. Take the girl, and the horse is yours." A girl of 19, sold for a horse. The phrase was uttered. It was out in the world, a monstrous, ugly thing. Ian looked past Clyde, past the mare, to the girl. She sat motionless, a small bundle clutched in her lap. She had not looked up, not once. She seemed to be waiting, as if she were a piece of freight. Ian finally spoke, His voice was flat. Dead. He ignored the horse. He ignored Clyde. His gaze was fixed on the girl. And the girl, he asked. The question seemed to confuse Clyde. He snapped his fingers. The girl, Iris. Yes, he was trading the horse for the girl. He repeated himself, as if Ian were simple. He gets the horse. Ian gets the girl. A simple, clean transaction. Ian looked at the mare. Lark, the last living thing that his wife had loved. He looked at the girl, a living thing this man treated like ballast. He understood the foul, twisted math. The horse was the price. The girl was the goods. He looked at Iris. She was small. Yes, but she did not plead or cry. She just waited. The absolute resignation in her posture, the way she had erased herself from the moment, struck Ian harder than a physical blow. He had seen men trade cattle, land, and mining claims. He had never seen this. He asked what right Clyde had to make this trade. Clyde's smile returned, triumphant. He was prepared. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, dirty piece of paper. He held it up like a winning card. Guardianship papers. He announced, signed and sealed by a judge in the last territory. He said she was his ward, his legal responsibility, his property to place as he saw fit. Ian looked at the paper, even from 10 feet away. The seal looked wrong, the ink too heavy in some places, too thin in others. It smelled of deceit, but it was still a paper. In the territory, paper held a dangerous power, even fake paper. It was a claim, and a claim had to be answered. Clyde added that she was difficult, ungrateful. He was doing Ian a favor, taking her off his hands and giving him a fine horse in the bargain. Ian's mind was a trap. If he said no, what would happen to her, this man? Clyde would take her to the next town or the next mining camp. He would find another buyer. The thought of what that meant made Ian's stomach clench. If he said yes, he was participating. He was buying a person. He looked at Lark. The mare nickered softly, recognizing the scent of the barn, the memory of home. He looked at Iris. He was a man drowning, and the only rope thrown to him was a venomous snake. If he took the horse that had belonged to his dead wife, he had to take the girl. If he took the girl to save her from this man, he had to accept the horse. It was a dirty, tangled bargain, and there was no clean way out. He made his decision. He did not bargain. He did not argue. He told Clyde to unhitch the horse. Clyde's victory was immediate and ugly. He laughed, a short, barking sound. He slapped his thigh. He quickly untied the lead rope for Lark from his own saddle horn and threw it to Ian. Ian caught it. The leather was worn smooth, familiar in his hand. Clyde then turned to Iris. He barked at her. "Get off the horse, get in the house. You belong to him now." Ian flinched at the words. He did not correct Clyde. He just watched, his hand gripping the lead rope. Iris' veil moved for the first time. She slid off the nag's back, her movements stiff. She did not look at Ian. She did not look at Clyde. She kept her eyes on the ground. She walked past Clyde, who sneered at her, and through the gate Ian held open. She walked toward the dark outline of the log house. Her steps were small and steady. She carried her bundle, a small cloth sack tied with string. In one hand, it seemed to be all she owned in the world. Ian watched her go. He looked at Clyde, who was already turning his own tired horse. Clyde tipped his hat in a mock salute. He said Ian had gotten himself a fine horse. He said nothing more about the girl. He spurred his mount, pulling the second nag behind him, and disappeared back into the darkness. The sound of his departure was quickly swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. Ian was left alone in the yard, holding the lead rope of his dead wife's horse. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more profound than before. He stood there for a long time, the mare standing quiet beside him. Then, with movements that felt heavy and old, he led Lark into the barn. He put her in the stall that had always been hers. He gave her fresh water and hay. The mare bumped his shoulder with her head. a gesture of old affection. He did not respond. His hands felt unclean. He finished the chore, secured the barn door, and walked to the house. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. Iris was standing just inside, exactly where she had stopped. She had not moved. She had not lit the lamp. She was a shadow against the shadows of the room, braced, waiting. Ayan moved past her to the fireplace. He struck a match and lit the oil lamp on the mantel. The small room filled with a weak, yellow light. He saw her clearly now. She was pale, her face smudged with dust. Her dress was thin and worn, the color of dishwater. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, tight knot. She was waiting for a blow, or a command, or an insult. Her whole body was a question of what new misery came next. Ian did not give her any of them. His house had 2 rooms, the main room with the hearth, stove, and his own bed, and a small, lean-to room off the back, more of a large pantry and storage area, barely big enough for a cot and some shelves. He pointed to the door of that room. He told her there was a cot. That would be her space. She nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. He went to the stove, opened the safe, and took out a heel of bread and a piece of dried beef. He put them on a tin plate and set it on the small wooden table. He motioned for her to eat. She looked at the food, then at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with a caution that was almost animal. He told her again, "Eat." She moved slowly to the table. She did not sit. She stood, picked up the bread, and began to eat, her movements small and quick, as if afraid the food would be taken away. Ayan turned his back to her. He checked the latch on the main door. He moved his rifle from its pegs by the door to the mantel, closer to his own bed. He made small, necessary movements, filling the silence with the sound of routine. He told her the rules of the house. The work started before sunrise. He expected her to pull her weight. She would tend the chickens, the small garden, and the house. He would handle the barn and the fences. He paused. He added that there was no lock on her door, but he did not enter that room. That was her space. He did not enter her space. She did not enter his, which was his bed in the main room. The boundary was clear, cold, impersonal. He was not her master. He was not her husband. He did not know what he was. He was a man who had just accepted a person as payment. The thought made him sick. She finished the bread, leaving the beef. He told her to eat it all. She obeyed, her eyes on the table. She stood by the table, waiting for the next order. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Ayan looked at her, this 19-year-old girl who had been sold to him. He felt a sudden, sharp need to draw a line, to separate himself from the man who had just ridden away. His voice was rough. He told her he did not want her here. He told her this was not a good arrangement, but he would not see her given to men like Clyde. He said, "So you will work. You will earn your keep." He searched for the words. He told her, "I do not keep prisoners." He said the words flatly, a statement of fact. He watched her. She did not move, but something in her changed. The line of her shoulders, braced for a lifetime of awfulness, seemed to drop by a fraction. A small, almost invisible shudder went through her. It was the first time she had looked him directly in the eye. Just for a second. He saw the terror there, but beneath it, a flicker of disbelief. He turned away. Uncomfortable. He told her to go to her room. The lamp would be out in 5 minutes. She disappeared into the small, dark room, closing the door softly behind her. Ayan sat on his own bed. He did not undress. He stared at the burned rafter above him. He had taken the horse. He had taken the girl. He had invited the memory of his wife and the complication of a living, breathing, terrified woman into his house of grief. The horse. Lark. He could not understand it. How did Clyde Marin get his hands on Sarah's horse? The man he sold her to was a good man, a Quaker heading east to family. He would not have gambled her away. The puzzle turned over and over in his mind. There was a darkness under this, a story that had not been told. The fake papers, the horse, the desperation to be rid of the girl. It felt like Clyde was not just making a trade. It felt like he was running from something. Ayan blew out the lamp. The room plunged into blackness. He lay back, his hands behind his head, staring at the dark from the other room. There was no sound, not a sigh, not a movement, just absolute, terrified silence. He had told her he did not keep prisoners, but as he lay there, listening to the vast, empty quiet of the territory, he wondered if he had just become one. The first light was a cold, gray smear against the small window of her room when Iris Vale woke. She had not slept, but had existed in a state of rigid terror. Listening to the breathing of the man in the other room, it was a steady, slow sound, unlike the wet, rattling snores of Clyde Marin. She was already dressed in her one-worn dress, her hands clasped together. She heard the scrape of a boot on the floorboards, then the metallic click of the stove door. He was up. She waited, her heart a dry knot in her chest, waiting for the bellow, the kick on the door. It did not come. Instead, she heard the splash of water, the rasp of a match, and the smell of coffee boiling. After several minutes, he knocked. It was not a bang, but 2 solid raps of a knuckle. His voice came through the wood, flat and without emotion. "The sun is coming. The chickens need feed and water. The buckets are by the well." She opened the door. He was standing by the hearth, his back to her, pouring coffee into a tin mug. He did not turn. He just gestured to the door. She slipped outside. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of juniper and dust. The world was huge, the sky endless, and the silence was overwhelming. She had never been in a place so quiet. She saw the well, the heavy wooden buckets beside it. She went to them. The rope was heavy. The well was low. It took all her strength to haul the first bucket up, her arms shaking. She filled the chicken trough and then went back for the house water. She stumbled. Water sloshed over the rim, soaking the front of her dress. She froze, expecting the hiss of a voice, the sound of a hand. Nothing. Ain Thorne was in the barn, his movements hidden, but the sound of his axe splitting wood was sharp and steady. One chop, one split, one piece tossed. She hauled the water inside. He came in a few minutes later, setting a bundle of fresh-cut kindling by the stove. He looked at her wet dress, then at the half-empty bucket. He said nothing about it. He told her to fry the bacon. They ate at the small table in silence. The bacon was thick, the coffee was black and bitter. Ayan Thorne ate quickly, his eyes on his plate. He had rules, he said, his voice quiet. "There is no spirits in this house, not at my table." And he said he would not abide profanity. He did not curse. He expected the same. He said a house, even a small one, should be a place of decency. Iris just nodded. He pointed to his work shirt, which hung on a peg, a long tear in the sleeve. He said that needed mending. He pointed to the fences at the west side of the property. He said they needed repair. He would be working on the posts. She was to bring water at midday. The work was brutal. It was harder than Clyde's chores. But it was different. It was the work of survival, not of spite. Clyde had made her haul rocks from one side of a yard to the other, just to watch her sweat. Ayan Thorne worked, and he worked beside her. When she went to the well again, he saw her struggle with the 2 heavy buckets. He did not comment on her weakness. He just walked over, took one of the buckets from her hand, and carried it himself. He told her to carry the other. They walked back to the house, side by side, in silence. It was the first time a man had shared a load with her. The simple, physical act of it was so strange, it made her feel unsteady. Later, she was stacking the wood he had split. She was clumsy, trying to work too fast, her movements jerky with nerves. A piece of juniper slipped and fell onto her boot. She gasped, grabbing her foot, and a stack of other logs tumbled over. She froze, bracing herself. Ayan stopped his axe mid-swing. He stood straight, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his arm. He watched her for a long, silent moment. She was trembling, trying to restack the wood with frantic, useless movements. He told her, "Stop." She stopped, her hands in the air. He said, "You are trying to prove something. Stop it. I do not require you to prove anything. I require the wood to be stacked. Do the work. The work is enough." Iris stared at him. The absence of rage was a vacuum. She did not know what to do with it. She felt a strange, painful bubble in her chest. It rose in her throat and came out as a short, sharp gasp, almost a cough. It was the driest, rustiest, most broken sound. It was the ghost of a laugh. It died as soon as it was born, and she clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he turned, lifted his axe, and split another log with a grunt. The moment was over. She turned back to the wood, her hands still shaking, but for a different reason. 2 days later, they needed supplies: salt, flour, and coffee. Ayan hitched the mule to the buckboard. He paused, looking at the house. He could not leave her. He did not trust her, and he did not trust the world. He told her to get in the wagon. The ride to Red Hollow was silent. Iris sat on the wagon bench, her back rigid. She had not been in a town, even one this small, in over a year. When they pulled onto the main street, the world stopped. The man outside the general store, the one with the heavy thumb, stopped rolling a barrel. 2 women in faded bonnets, standing by the church, stopped talking and turned as one. They stared. Ain Thorne, the widower who never came to town except for supplies and never spoke, was sitting next to a young, pale, terrified-looking girl. Ayen kept his eyes forward. He pulled the wagon up to the store and got down. He told Iris to stay put. The whispers started before his boot hit the porch. They were not loud, but they were sharp, like the sound of insects in dry grass. Pity, scandal, judgment. Ian went inside. Iris stared at her own hands, clasped in her lap. She could feel the eyes on her, picking at her like buzzards. Reverend Cole Avery stepped out of the small chapel, his black coat dusty. He was a tall man, and his shadow fell over the wagon. He looked at Iris. His eyes were not unkind, but they were searching. Ian came back out, a sack of flour over his shoulder. He saw the Reverend. He nodded, a short, stiff greeting. Reverend Avery did not mince words. He said, "Ian, I saw Clyde Marin ride through 2 days ago. He was in a hurry." Ian said, "He was—" The Reverend glanced at Iris, then back at Ian. He lowered his voice, but Iris could still hear every word. He said, "Folks are wondering, Ian, that man was a poison snake, and he left you with—" He paused, searching for the word. He said, "He showed me a paper, claimed she was his kin, his niece." Ian said, "That is what he claimed." Avery sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He said, "In the territory, a man's reputation is all he has. You live alone. This arrangement, it gives tongues a reason to wag, and a tongue in this town can be sharper than a skinning knife." Ian finished loading the salt. He said, "Let them wag." Avery put a hand on his arm. He said, "It is not just the talk. It is the man. Clyde Marin is a slick creature. He uses paper like a weapon. If he claims blood, even false blood, he might get it in his head to come back. He might make a legal claim, try to demand her return, or demand payment. He is a man who knows how to make trouble. Be watchful." Ian looked at the Reverend. His gray eyes were flat. He said, "I am always watchful." As they spoke, a woman walked across the street from the small cabin by the creek. It was Mara Doone, the midwife. She was older, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes missing nothing. She carried a basket. She walked straight to the wagon, ignoring Ian and the Reverend. She looked up at Iris. Mara Doone said, "You look thin, child, and your hands, She reached up and, before Iris could flinch away, took her wrist. She examined the raw, calloused skin. Mara's voice was low and sharp. She said, "I knew your mother, Mary, back in the Cimarron Valley. She was a good woman." Iris's head snapped up. She stared at the old woman. Mara continued, her voice for Iris alone. She said, "I also know that snake Clyde Marin. He is no more your uncle than I am the Pope. Your mother passed, and he took you, told the county folk he was providing for kin. He was providing himself with a slave. That paper he carries is not worth the ink he used to sign it." The world seemed to drop out from under Iris. All these years, the shame of being a burden on her family had been a stone in her gut. To know it was all a lie, that he had no right, no claim at all. It was a terrifying, hollow freedom. Mara squeezed her wrist. She said, "You're on your own, child, which means you are your own. Remember that." She pressed a small tin into Iris's hand. She said, "For your hands. Comfrey and tallow. Use it." Mara turned and walked away, leaving Iris staring at the small, greasy tin. The ride back to the ranch was just as silent, but everything had changed. The whispers of the town, the Reverend's warning, Mara's words. Ian seemed to feel the tension, too. He was even more withdrawn, his jaw set in a hard line. When they returned, he told her to put the supplies away in the barn, in the cooler root cellar dug into the back wall. Iris went into the cool, sweet-smelling dark of the barn. Lark, his wife's mare, nickered at her from the stall. Iris was still afraid of the large animal, but she walked past. She moved toward the back, past the stacked harnesses and burlap. Her hand brushed against something on a low, dusty shelf. It was small. She picked it up. It was a little wooden horse, crudely carved. One side of it was smooth. The other was blackened, charred. The wood burned into smooth, dark waves. Ian entered the barn. The light from the open door silhouetted him. He saw her, holding the toy. His body went rigid. His voice was a choked rasp. He said, "Put that down." Iris dropped it as if it were a hot coal. It hit the dirt floor with a soft thud. She stammered. She was sorry. She did not mean. She was just moving the sacks. Ian did not move for a full minute. He stared at the toy on the ground. The silence in the barn was absolute, heavy as stone. Iris did not breathe. Finally, he spoke. His voice was torn raw. He said, "It was my boys." It was an admission, a crack in the wall. He said his name was Eli. He was 3. The fire, it took them, him, and his mother, Sarah. He did not cry. He did not move. He just said the words, the central, terrible facts of his life, into the dusty air. Iris looked at him. She saw the hollows under his eyes, the deep, settled grief that she had mistaken for simple hardness. She saw the man, not the master. She looked at the charred toy, and she understood the black scar on the rafter in the house. She did not know what to say. There were no words for such a thing. She just gave a small, jerky nod, acknowledging the ghosts he lived with. Ian bent down, his large, calloused hand, the one that had carried the heavy bucket, gently picked up the wooden horse. He did not hide it. He did not throw it. He wiped the dust from it on his pants. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached up and set it on a high shelf, in a sliver of light from a crack in the wall. He left it there, visible. The first layer of ice had broken. That evening, Ian went out to check the fences, the ones he had planned to mend. He stood for a long time, looking west. The wind was picking up, and the sky was a sickly yellow-green. Clouds were gathering, heavy and low, piling up on the horizon. A section of the west fence was down. 2 posts were snapped clean. It was not rot. It looked as if something, or someone, had pushed them over. Ian Thorne looked at the broken fence, and he looked at the gathering storm. He could not tell which one would hit first. The broken fence was a fresh wound on the land, a sign of malice. Ian Thorne stood looking at it. his face grim. The wind was a living thing, pushing against his back, smelling of ozone and distant, wet dirt. The sky was a bruised, sickly green, and the clouds piled on the horizon were the color of lead. The storm was not just coming, it was here. He turned and strode back to the house, his movements long and urgent. He did not run. Iris was on the porch, holding a basket of eggs, her eyes wide, fixed on the unnatural sky. He pointed to the barn. He said, "Check the latches, all of them, and the chickens. Get them in the coop. Bar the door. I will see to the mule and the mare." His voice was tight, clipped. This was not a request. It was a command born of necessity. Iris did not question. She dropped the basket, the eggs forgotten, and ran toward the small chicken coop. Ian entered the barn. The air inside was heavy and still, the animals already nervous. Lark, the mare, paced in her stall, her ears flat. The mule was kicking at the wooden partition. Ian moved between them, his voice a low rumble, not of comfort, but of command. He checked the leather of the halters, shortened the ropes. He moved sacks of feed away from the main door. The first gust hit the barn like a physical blow. The old wood groaned. A sound like 1,000 marbles rolling across the roof was the first volley of hail. Then the wind truly opened its throat and screamed. Iris scrambled back from the coop, her hair ripped from its knot, whipping across her face. She fought her way to the house, threw her shoulder against the door, and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. Ian was in the barn, fighting to calm the mare. Lark was not just a horse. She was a creature of memory, and the rising panic in the barn, the scream of the wind, the crash of hail, was too close to the memory of fire. She reared, her front hooves striking the stall door, her eyes white with terror. Ian grabbed for her halter, but she threw her head, dodging him. He felt the old, cold dread rise in his own chest, the smell of the horse, the animal terror. It was the same. He saw the fire. He saw the smoke. He was not in the barn. He was back in that night 3 years ago, his hands useless. Then, a sound, a crash that was not the storm. A section of the barn roof, old and weakened, tore loose and was flung into the darkness. Rain and hail blasted into the hayloft, instantly soaking the dry straw. The mule brayed, a sound of pure panic. Lark went wild, crashing against the boards, a terrible high whinny tearing from her throat. Ian was frozen, his back against the wall, his breath locked in his chest. The barn door was torn open. Iris stood there, framed against the violent green-gray light. She was drenched, her thin dress plastered to her body. She held no lantern. There was no light to be had. Ian bellowed. "Here!" Ian shouted at her, his voice ripped away by the wind. He told her to get back, get to the house. She did not listen. She saw the state of him, frozen. She saw the horse, mad with fear. She was terrified, but her terror was clear. She looked past the man and saw the animal. She grabbed a heavy burlap sack from a hook. She moved into the stall, not at the horse, but beside it, keeping her body low. She spoke, her voice high and thin, but steady. She was repeating a nonsense word, a soft, shushing sound. The horse stopped its frantic movement, focusing on the new object, the new voice. Iris moved in, quick as a snake, and threw the burlap sack over the mare's head, covering her eyes. Lark shuddered, a massive, trembling wave through her body, but with her vision gone, with only the girl's voice and the strange, rough cloth. Her panic subsided. She stood, shaking, but she stood. The action broke Ian's paralysis. He lunged forward, grabbing the halter. He snapped a lead rope on. He saw what Iris had done. He did not pause to praise or question. He just acted. He shouted at Iris to get the mule. Together, in the heart of the storm. They worked. They were two small, soaked figures in a world of chaos. They moved the animals, slipping in the wet hay and mud, to the most secure stalls on the leeward side of the barn. Ayan saw Iris shaking, her body trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Her thin dress was useless. He did not think. He ripped his own heavy canvas coat from his shoulders and threw it over her. It was a massive weight, smelling of him, of sweat and leather and wet wool. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging a foot past her hands. He put his hand on her back, covered by the coat, and pushed her toward the door. He yelled that they were done. Go! They ran together through the churning mud, heads down, the rain like needles. They burst into the house, slamming the door against the wind, dropping the bar. The cabin was a refuge, but a cold one. Water dripped from the edges of the chimney, hissing on the hearth. They stood, two drowned creatures, breathing hard, the roar of the storm outside a constant, deafening presence. Ayan moved to the fire, tossing on dry wood, coaxing the flames high. Iris stood by the hearth, water pooling around her feet. She was still wrapped in his coat, her small, pale face looking out from the huge collar. He looked at her. Her eyes were dark, not with fear, but with the shock of survival. She had seen him freeze. She had seen his deep, abiding terror, the ghost that ruled him. And she had not run, she had acted. He had seen her courage. He turned away from her, breaking the intense gaze. He grabbed a rough towel from a hook and tossed it to her. He told her to get dry. He kept his back to her, staring into the fire, giving her the privacy of his gaze averted. He said nothing of his fear, and she said nothing of her bravery. The shared knowledge was enough. The next morning, the world was silent, scoured, and painfully bright. The sky was a high, clear blue. They stepped outside into a world remade. The broken fence was gone, its rails scattered. The barn roof had a gaping hole, but the sun was warm. They did not speak of the night, they spoke of the work. Ayan pointed, the barn first, then the fence. They pulled the soaked hay from the loft, spreading it on the ground to dry in the sun. They hung their wet clothes on a line strung between the porch and a tree. His heavy shirt, her one thin dress, his canvas coat. They hung side by side, dripping in the bright morning light. The sunlight felt like a payment, a reward. A new rhythm began, forged in the storm. They were no longer a man and his burden. They were two people against the land. They repaired the fence. Ayan dug the deep post holes, his muscles straining. Iris dragged the heavy rails, her thin arms shaking with the effort. But she did not stop. She helped him set the posts, holding them steady as he tamped the dirt. He watched her hands. They were raw, the blisters from the wood stacking broken and bleeding. She worked without complaint. Mara Dune had given her a small tin of salve. That night, Iris sat by the fire, rubbing the greasy comfrey into her palms. Ayan watched her. He said nothing, but he fetched a pair of his old leather work gloves. Stiff with use, he dropped them in her lap. He told her they were too big, but they were better than skin. Iris pulled them on. They were huge, but they were a shield. She began to claim her space, not with words, but with actions. One evening, Ayan came in, exhausted from stringing new wire. He smelled it before he saw it, the smell of baking bread. Iris was standing by the stove, a flush on her cheeks from the heat. She had found his sourdough starter. She had used their flour. She had baked 2 round, dark loaves. She tensed when he entered, her old fear returning. She had taken a liberty, used resources without his order. He stopped, just inside the door. He looked at the bread. He looked at her. He did not scold. He did not praise. He just walked to the table, sat down, and nodded. He said, "It smells good." Iris let out a breath she did not know she was holding. It was a small, quiet step, but it was a step from servitude into partnership. She had made a choice. The ritual of the empty bowl continued. Every night, Ayan set the table, his plate, her plate, and a small, empty bowl set near his elbow. It was for his son, Eli. It was a space for the ghost. Iris had watched this for weeks. She understood it. It was a place for his grief. One night, she set the table instead. She put down the plates, and she put down the small bowl. But she did not leave it empty. She took the pitcher of clean water and poured a little into it. She did not remove the memory. She honored it. Ian came to the table. He saw the bowl, the clear water shining in it. He stopped. His hand, reaching for the chair, paused. He looked at her. Iris did not meet his gaze. She just served the stew. He sat down. He said nothing, but the heavy, cold silence that always filled the room had eased. The ghost was still there, but it was no longer starving. They had to go to Red Hollow. The storm had taken shingles from the roof. They needed nails. When they pulled the buckboard onto the main street, the town watched, as before, but the whispers were different. They were not of scandal. They were of curiosity. The Thorn Ranch had survived the storm. Mara Doone was waiting for them. She did not come to the wagon. She called Iris over. She looked at her hands, now protected by the large gloves. Mara grunted, a sound of approval. She pointed up. She said, "See those clouds? Thin, high, like a mare's tail. Wind, tomorrow. You learn to read the sky, child. It tells fewer lies than men." Reverend Cole Avery found Ian by the lumber stack. He was not there to preach. He was there as the law. He spoke in a low voice. He said, "Hey, Ian, I heard you had damage. A fence down." Ian said, "The storm was strong." Avery shook his head. He said, "I heard the fence was pushed, not blown. A storm is one thing, malice is another." Ian's face darkened. Avery looked over at Iris, who was listening to Mara. He said, "You are a man alone. With a new responsibility, be watchful. A stray bullet finds an easy home where trouble is already brewing. Clyde Marin has a long memory for what he thinks he is owed." The words hung in the air, a second, darker storm cloud. That night, the house was quiet. The new shingles were in the wagon. The fence was mended. Iris was mending his shirt, her stitches small and neat. She did it without being told. She finally asked the question that had lived in her for weeks. She asked him why. Why he shared the work. Why he had not just left her in the house. A servant? Ian sat at the table, sharpening his axe blade with a whetstone. The sound was a rhythmic, scratching whisper. He did not stop his work. He did not give her a kind answer. He gave her a true one. He said, "Out here, you do not last long by yourself. The land, the winter, other men, they eat you. People need each other to live. It is just that." It was not a declaration of affection. It was a declaration of fact. But for Iris, it was the first time she had ever been counted as needed. It was a foundation, solid as rock. A few days later, Ian was preparing to ride out to the high pasture. He needed to check the small spring, see if the storm had clogged it. It was a full day's ride. He stopped at the porch. Iris was sweeping, her movements sure, no longer jerky or afraid. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a large, heavy iron key. He held it out to her. She looked at the key, then at him. He said, "The salt for the animals is in the locked shed. The mule needs a block, and the shutter for the back window is in there. It needs oil on the hinges." Iris slowly reached out and took the key. It was cold and heavy in her palm. She understood. The shed was not just tools. It was the ammunition. It was the bags of salt, more valuable than gold in the winter. It was the seed for the next planting. It was the core of their survival. He was giving her the key. He did not say, "I trust you." He did not need to. He just nodded, a short, sharp gesture. He turned, walked to the barn, and soon she heard the sound of Lark's hooves as he rode out. Iris stood on the porch, the sun just beginning to warm the air. She uncurled her fingers and looked at the iron key sitting in the center of her calloused, healing palm. It was the heaviest thing she had ever held. She closed her hand around it, the metal biting into her skin. She was not a prisoner. She was not a possession. She was the one who held the key. The world turned. The raw, scoured land left by the storm healed under the soft touch of autumn. The violent greens of summer faded to a deep, dusty gold. The air was no longer an affliction. It was a mercy. Crisp in the mornings and carrying the sharp, sweet scent of drying grass and distant wood smoke. They worked, their rhythm now a settled thing. They cut and stacked the last of the hay, the stalks cured and yellow. They sealed the cracks in the cabin walls with fresh mud and straw. Preparing for the bite of winter, Iris, wearing the oversized leather gloves, had moved from fear to a quiet competence. One late afternoon, Ayan finished reinforcing a gate hinge and turned back toward the barn. The sun was low, striking the corral at an angle, and the air was thick with golden light. He stopped. Iris was in the corral with Lark. She was not just feeding the mare. She was standing by her shoulder, her hand, the glove removed, moving in long, slow strokes down the horse's neck. She was speaking, her voice too low for him to hear the words. A soft, crooning murmur. The horse, his wife's horse, the animal that had been a creature of pure terror during the storm, stood perfectly still. Her head was low, her ears soft, listening. Iris had tamed the ghost. Ayan walked toward them, his boots silent in the thick dust. Iris did not startle until he was at the fence. She pulled her hand back, her old caution rising. He did not look at her. He looked at the mare. His voice was quiet. "She was my wife's," he said. "Sarah. She raised her from a foal. She had a way with her. The night of the fire, Lark was the only living thing that came out. She broke her stall. She ran." Iris watched his face. It was a landscape of old grief, but the light softened it. He continued, his gaze distant. I sold her. I sold her to a good man, heading east. I could not stand the sight of her. She was too much of Sarah. How Clyde Marin got his hands on her, I still do not know, but seeing her at that gate..." He finally turned his eyes to Iris. They were clear, his gaze direct. "That night," he said, his voice flat, making a simple, hard statement. "That night with Marin, I did not buy you. I did not trade for you." Iris's hand, which had been resting on the top rail of the fence, gripped it. "I took the horse," he said, "because she was Sarah's, and I took you because I could not leave you with that man. What he did, that was his poison. Not mine, not yours." He looked at her, this small woman who had mended his clothes, stacked his wood, and faced a storm with him. "You are not my property, Iris Vale. You are not a prisoner here. You have earned your keep 10 times over." He opened his hand, a gesture that encompassed the ranch, the house, the vast, empty land. "If you want to go, I will hitch the mule to the buckboard. I will give you the wages you have earned. I will take you to the stage line in the next town. You can go east. You can go west. The choice is yours." He had given her the definition of being treated like gold. He had given her back herself. Iris stared at him. The sheer, terrifying weight of choice was something she had never known. She tried to imagine it, getting on a stage, going to a town where she knew no one. The world she knew was Clyde's cruelty and Ian's quiet decency. There was nothing else. She shook her head, a small, lost movement. Her voice was a whisper, caught in her throat. "I have nowhere to go." Ian held her gaze. He nodded slowly, as if accepting a solemn agreement. "Then you stay," he said, "not because you were sold, but because you choose to stay." The air between them changed. The transaction that had bound them was broken, undone by a few simple words. What remained was something new, something untested. That night, the new quiet in the cabin was almost loud. It was no longer the silence of a master and a servant, or a jailer and a prisoner. It was the silence of two people who had seen each other's truth. They ate the bread she had baked and a stew he had made. After, as was their custom, she sat by the fire, mending one of his shirts. He sat at the table, oiling a piece of harness leather. She was the one who broke the quiet. "Clyde Marin," she said, her voice steady. Ian stopped his work, his hands still on the leather. He waited. Mara was right. He was not my uncle. My mother died. There was a man, Harlan Price. He was my stepfather. She said the name as if it were a stone in her mouth. He was not a good man. When she died, he did not want me. Clyde came. He knew Harlan. Clyde, he finds things for men. He finds horses they lost, or debts they are owed. He told Harlan he could find a place for me. For a price. He was a broker. He took me. He had those papers made. She finished, her hands clenched in her lap, the needle forgotten. She had given him her truth, a small, dark piece of her past, to place alongside his own. Ian's face was hard in the firelight. Harlan Price. He filed the name away. It was not just a drifter now. It was a darkness with a name. His eyes fell to her hands. He saw a long, red scratch on her wrist. From the fence wire she had been helping him stretch that morning. It was raw, beaded with blood. He stood. She tensed. He walked past her to a high shelf and took down a small, round tin. He brought it to the hearth. "You did that on the wire," he said. It was not a question. She nodded. He unlidded the tin. The sharp, clean scent of pine filled the air. Pine salve. It stops the festering. He knelt by her chair. He did not ask. He simply reached out and took her wrist. His hand was huge, the skin rough as bark, enveloping her arm. She flinched, but did not pull away. His touch was not gentle, but it was careful. He dipped 2 fingers in the dark, sticky salve, and spread it over the cut. He was methodical. She could feel the heat from his hand, the slight, abrasive texture of his calluses. She sat frozen. Her breath caught. She could hear him breathing. A slow, steady sound. It was the closest he had ever been. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the small, human sounds of 2 people existing in one space. He finished. His fingers lingered for a second, not in a caress, but as if to make sure the salve was set. Then he let go of her wrist and stood, stepping back. The spell was broken. "It will heal clean," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. He went back to the table, picked up his rag, and resumed oiling the leather. She sat by the fire, the sting of the pine on her skin, her heart beating a strange, heavy rhythm. A few days later, a cold wind came down from the north, a true messenger of winter. It worried the roof and whistled at the door. Iris, her hair now longer and healthier than it had ever been, was constantly pushing it out of her face. Ian watched her struggle with it as she served him his coffee. He said nothing, but after breakfast, he walked to the small wooden box on the mantel. It was a carved box, dark with age. She had seen him look at it, but never open it. It was Sarah's. He opened it. He fumbled inside for a moment, then took something out. He walked to her. "Your hair," he said, gesturing with his chin. "The wind is a trouble." He held out his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a hair comb. It was not gold, but made of heavy brass, polished to a dull shine, its teeth long and sturdy. Iris's hand flew to her mouth. She knew what it was. She said that was hers. He nodded, his face unreadable. Yes, she would not want it to sit in a box. She would want it to be used. He pushed his hand closer. "It is for keeping the wind from your hair. That is all." He was not offering her his wife's place. He was not offering romance. He was offering a tool, a practical piece of brass to solve a practical problem. It was an act of profound, respectful care. Her fingers trembled as she took it. It was heavy and warm from his hand. She turned, her back to him, and gathered her hair. She twisted it, pulling it into a knot at the base of her neck, and slid the comb into place. It held firm, secure. She did not thank him. He did not expect it. The gift was the only word necessary. The next week, they had to go to Red Hollow. The supplies for winter could not wait. They needed flour and salt in quantity, beans, and more ammunition. When they stood at the counter of the general store, Hiram, the proprietor, tallied the goods. He ran his pencil down a long, narrow ledger. "That is a heavy load. Ian," he said, "it will be $14 on your account." Ian nodded. He put his hand on the counter. He said, "And one more thing." Hiram looked up, his pencil poised. Ian looked at Iris, who stood beside him, the brass comb shining in her hair. He looked back at Hiram. "From now on, Iris Vale signs for this ranch. Her name in the book. It is the same as mine." Hiram's eyebrows climbed his forehead. This was not a small thing. In the territory, credit was life. Giving her the right to sign was making her a partner. It gave her a name, a legal standing in the town. He looked from Ian's stone-serious face to Iris's pale, shocked one. He pursed his lips. Then he nodded slowly. "As you say, Ian." He turned the heavy ledger book around on the counter and dipped his pen in the inkwell. He handed the pen to Iris. "Sign here, Miss, right here, so I have your signature for the book." Iris looked at Ian. He gave a single, short nod. "Your choice." She took the pen. Her hand was shaking, but she gripped it. In clear, careful letters, she wrote her name, Iris Vale. She had seen her name written only once before, on Clyde's false paper. Now, she had written it herself, on a book of truths. "Done," Hiram said, closing the ledger. As Ian counted out some coins for tobacco, Hiram leaned closer to him, his voice low. "Ian, be watchful." Ian's head came up. "What is it?" "Two men," Hiram muttered, not looking at him. "Busy wiping the counter. They were not from here. Rough-looking. They rode in 2 days ago. Asked questions." "What questions?" Ian's voice was flat, cold. "They asked where the Thorn Ranch was. They asked about the girl. They called her Clyde's girl. Said he was looking to get his property back." Ian's body went rigid. Hiram shook his head. "They were not good men. Ian, they had that look. They rode south, but they were asking." Ian said nothing. He paid for his goods, his movement stiff and economical. He and Iris loaded the wagon in silence. The ride home was heavy. The wind was colder, the golden light of autumn gone, replaced by a high, gray sky. That night, the quiet in the cabin was different again. It was the taut, stretched silence of waiting. Iris sat by the fire, but she was not mending. Her hands were still. Ian was cleaning his rifle, a task he usually did in the barn. The smell of gun oil was sharp in the small room. He finished his work, sliding the bolt back into place with a heavy, metallic click. He laid the rifle across the table. He looked at Iris, who was watching him, her eyes dark. "He's coming," Ian said. Iris did not pretend not to understand. "Clyde." "And the other one? The one you named?" "Harlan Price." She nodded, her face pale but set. "Yes." Ian stood and walked to the hearth, looking down into the flames. The firelight caught the brass comb in her hair, making it gleam like true gold. He turned to her, his shadow falling across the floor. "The last storm," he said, his voice low and certain. "We were caught by it." His gaze held hers. "When this next storm comes, we will stand together." It was not a question. It was not an offer. It was a promise, short and hard as a nail driven into oak. The promise hung in the small cabin, a tangible thing. We will stand together. It changed the texture of the following days. The high, gray sky held its breath. Ian and Iris moved with a new, shared tension. Every task was performed with one eye on the horizon. He cleaned his rifle every night. She counted the ammunition, her lips moving silently, and stacked it neatly on the shelf he had built. The quiet was broken 3 days later, not by riders, but by the rattle of a wagon, Ian was by the barn, oiling the well pump. He straightened, his hand dropping to the pistol he now wore on his hip. Iris came to the cabin door, drying her hands on an apron. It was Reverend Cole Avery's wagon, and Mara Doone sat beside him. Ian walked to meet them, his face hard with questions. Mara did not wait for him to ask. She climbed down, her movement stiff but determined. She said, "Hiram told us, about the men, about the questions." Avery secured the reins, his face drawn with worry. He was not wearing his preacher's coat, just his shirt and the star. He said, "Ian, we came to talk, as the law, and as your neighbors. What Hiram said, it is more than just talk now. There is a darkness in this." Mara looked at Iris, who had come to stand a few feet behind Ian. She said, "A man like Clyde, he does not forget a slight, and he does not forgive a prophet he thinks he lost." Ian's voice was flat. He knows he cannot just take her. The paper is false. Avery shook his head, his gaze sweeping the empty road behind him. That is where law and reason part ways. Ian, a false paper is a fine excuse to pull a true gun. He thinks he has a claim. He will act on it. We came to say, you are not alone in this. The town is wary, but I am not. As the words left his mouth, a new sound came from the road. Not a wagon, but the fast, rhythmic drum of horses. 3 riders. They were not ambling. They were coming with purpose. Ian's hand moved from his pistol to the rifle leaning against the porch. He said to Iris, his voice low, his eyes on the riders, "Get inside. Bolt the door." Iris looked at him. She looked at Mara. She said no. She did not move, but her chin came up. She had the iron key in her pocket. She had signed the ledger. She was not going to hide. The riders pulled up just outside the mended fence line, fanning out in a half circle. The man in the middle was Clyde Marin, his weasel face twisted in a mocking smile. The 2 men with him were not drifters. They were hard, empty-eyed men who wore their pistols low and tied down. Clyde tipped his hat, a gesture of pure insult. "Well now, Thorne, looks like you are having a prayer meeting." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He gestured at Avery. "Good. You can save me the trouble of finding you. Sheriff, I am here on a legal matter." His eyes slid to Iris. He licked his lips. "I have come for my property." Avery stepped forward, his body placing him between Clyde and the porch. His voice was steady. "That is enough, Marin. You have no property here. You have no business here. I'm telling you, as the law in this county, to move on." Clyde's smile widened. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. He reached into his coat and pulled out the same stained, folded paper. "I have a paper. Sheriff says she is my ward, my blood, my responsibility." He waved it in the air, signed and sealed. Avery did not even look at the paper. He said, "I have seen that paper. Clyde, it is not worth the match to burn it. The seal is from a county that does not exist anymore, and the signature on it is as false as your smile. You have no claim." The 2 gunmen shifted, their hands resting near their hips. Clyde's smile faltered, his anger rising. He said, "Are you a lawman, Avery, or a preacher? You cannot be both at the same time. This is a family matter." Ian had not moved. He stood by the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand, muzzle down. He spoke for the first time, his voice a low, cold rumble. "You have no family here. Clyde." Clyde's head snapped toward him. He sneered. "I made a deal with you, Thorne. A fair trade. You got a fine horse." He pointed at Lark, who was watching from the corral. Her ears pricked forward. "You got a fine horse, and I got rid of a burden, but it seems I was wrong. She is not just a burden. She is valuable, and I am here to collect." One of the gunmen, a thick man with a scarred lip, was tired of the talk. He said, "Just take her. Clyde, we are wasting daylight." He put his hand on his holster. a deliberate, slow movement. Ian's voice cut through the air, sharp and final. "Don't!" The man's hand paused. He looked at Ian. He saw a farmer, a widower. He did not see the man who had faced fire and ruin. He smiled, a broken-toothed sneer, and his hand moved, pulling the iron from the leather. The explosion from Ian's rifle was deafening. It was not a warning shot. He did not aim to kill. He aimed to stop. The bullet struck the gunman high in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around before he collapsed into the dust, screaming. It happened in a second. The second gunman reacted, pulling his own weapon and firing. The shot was wild, panicked. It tore a chunk of wood from the porch post, inches from Ian's head. The world erupted. The horses screamed. Lark reared in the corral, her whinny a sound of pure terror. Iris, frozen for one heartbeat, moved. She did not run. She grabbed Mara Doone, who was standing exposed in the yard. She yanked the older woman with all her strength, pulling her toward the cabin. "Get inside," she yelled. "Get down!" She shoved Mara through the door and turned. Ian and the second gunman had both taken cover. Ian behind the solid corner of the cabin, the gunman behind his horse. The gunman fired again. The bullet thudded into the log wall. Clyde, the coward, was scrambling, trying to get his own horse between him and the house. He was fumbling for his pistol, his face pale with shock. Ian stepped out, his movements fluid, the rifle to his shoulder. He did not aim for Clyde. He aimed for the threat, the second gunman. The gunman fired at the same time. The bullet hissed past Ian's ear. Ian's shot was true. It hit the fence rail in front of the gunman, sending a spray of sharp, wooden splinters into his face and chest. The man screamed and dropped his gun, clutching his eyes. Clyde finally managed to pull his own pistol. He raised it, his hand shaking, pointing it at the porch, at Ian. Ian worked the lever of his rifle, ejecting the spent shell, chambering a new one. From the cabin door, Iris screamed, "Ian!" Clyde fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near the well. Ian raised his rifle. He had a clear shot at Clyde. His finger tightened on the trigger. He did not shoot. He lowered the barrel a fraction of an inch and fired at the ground in front of Clyde's horse. The bullet struck the dirt, erupting in a cloud of dust. Clyde's horse screamed, reared, and bolted. Clyde, caught off guard, was thrown, his pistol flying from his hand. He hit the ground hard, rolling, and came up clutching his arm, which had struck a rock. It was over. The first gunman was on the ground, groaning, his shoulder a red ruin. The second was blinded, cursing and stumbling, holding his face. Clyde was disarmed, his arm broken or sprained, his face a mask of dirt and terror. The silence that fell was shocking, heavier than the gunfire. It was broken only by the sound of the wounded men and the panicked stamping of the horses. Clyde got to his feet, clutching his useless arm. He looked at Ian, who stood, the rifle held steady, smoke curling from the hot barrel. Clyde's face was a terrible thing, a mixture of pain, humiliation, and pure distilled hatred. He backed away, his eyes never leaving Ian. "This is not over. Thorn!" he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "This is not done. She is mine. I have the paper. I will be back. And I will not come with just these two. I will bring hell with me." He scrambled for his horse, which had stopped a few dozen yards away. The second gunman, still blinded, stumbled after him. Clyde, using his one good arm, managed to climb into the saddle. He did not wait for his partner. He spurred the horse and galloped away, a retreating figure of dust and malice. The second gunman followed, riding blind, his horse following Clyde's. They left the first gunman in the dust. Ian stood, his body rigid. The rifle still pointed down the empty road. The immediate danger was gone. Avery, who had drawn his own pistol but never fired, walked slowly into the yard, his gun still in his hand. Mara came out of the cabin, her face pale but set. Iris stepped onto the porch. She looked at Ian. He was frozen, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. He lowered the weapon. He turned, his movements stiff. He leaned the rifle against the wall. He reached for the box of cartridges on the porch railing to replace the rounds he had spent. His hands were shaking. It was not a tremor. It was a violent, uncontrollable quake. He could not pick up the small, brass cartridges. His fingers fumbled, clumsy and useless. Iris saw it. The smell of burnt gunpowder, the flash of the shots, the screams. It was the fire. It was the memory of the fire, rising up to claim him, the same way it had in the storm. His ghost was upon him. She moved. She did not hesitate. She walked to him, past Avery, past Mara. She placed her small, calloused hand over his, pressing his shaking fingers flat against the railing. "Ian," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the fog in his head. He looked at her. His eyes were wide, seeing not the yard, but flames. She said his name again. "Ian, it is done. You are here. We are here." He stared at her hand, so small, covering his. He shuddered, a long, deep breath tearing out of his chest. He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the fire was gone. He was back. He turned his hand over and, for a moment, his fingers closed around hers. A brief, desperate grip. Then he let go. The shaking had subsided. He took a deep breath. Slowly, with deliberate, careful movements, he picked up 3 cartridges and reloaded the rifle. Avery let out his own breath. He holstered his pistol and looked at the man on the ground, who was now staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. Avery said, "That was clean shooting. Yeah, justified. I saw it all." Mara, her medical instincts taking over, went to the man, tearing a strip of cloth from her petticoat to make a bandage. Avery looked at Ian. He nodded toward the dust cloud, now faint in the distance. "He is a coward, but his hate is strong." He meant what he said. "He will be back." Ian nodded, his face grim. "I know." He looked at Iris, who had not moved from his side. Later, after Avery had hauled the wounded gunman back to town to be locked in the small jail cell behind the chapel, the news began to spread. The man, in a fever and fear of the noose, talked. Mara, who had heard it from Hiram, who had heard it from Avery, rode back to the ranch late that night. She found Aeon and Iris sitting on the porch, the clean rifle on Aeon's lap, watching the moon rise. Mara's voice was heavy. The man talked. He said Clyde was running from a debt in another territory. He said this was not about the trade. Not anymore. It was about getting money. Any way he could. Ian said, "We knew that." Mara shook her head. "No, you do not. The man said Clyde has sent word. He has a partner in this, the man who gave Iris to him in the first place. He said Clyde has called for Harlan Price." The name hung in the cold night air. An invisible poison. Harlan Price. Mara Doone looked from Ian's rigid face to Iris's, which had gone as pale and still as ice. The older woman nodded. Her duty done. The warning had been delivered. She mounted her mule, exchanged a single grim look with Ian, and rode back toward the dim lights of Red Hollow. Ian and Iris stood on the porch, not moving, listening to the hoofbeats fade into the immense, uncaring silence of the territory. Harlan Price, the man Iris had named in the firelight, the man who was not family but a broker of misery, the Root. Ian turned, his movement stiff. He looked at the cabin, the dark outline of the barn, the sturdy fences he and Iris had mended. He had built this place from the sod up. He had lost a family here. He would not lose another. He spoke, his voice low and final, a man stating a fact. "I will not wait for the wolves to come to the pen." Iris looked at him, her eyes dark but steady. She understood. He was not a man who would bar the door and wait for a siege. He was a man who would meet the threat in the wilderness on his own terms. He went inside. He did not speak of fear or of chances. He moved with a cold, economical purpose. He checked his rifle, the one he had just reloaded. He slid a box of cartridges into the deep pocket of his canvas coat. He took his heavier pistol, the one he had not worn in the yard, and checked its load before shoving it into his belt. From the kitchen safe, he took a long strip of dried beef and a small sack of parched corn. He filled his canteen at the water bucket. Iris watched him. She did not cry or plead. She moved to the stove, took the coffee pot, and poured the last of the hot liquid into a tin mug. She held it out to him. He took it and drank it down, the hot, bitter coffee a fuel for the cold night ahead. He set the mug down. He looked at her. He said, "Bar the door after I am gone. The top bar and the bottom, do not open it. Do not open it for any voice you hear, unless you are certain it is mine." Iris nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He continued, his voice flat. "Giving orders. The shotgun is by the hearth. There are 12 shells in the box. If they get past me, if they come here, you wait until they are at the door. You wait until you cannot miss." She nodded again. He put his hand on the door latch, then paused. He was going to hunt 2, maybe 3 men, in the dark. He knew the chances. He looked back at her, at the brass comb shining in her hair in the lamplight. He said, "You have the key. You signed the book. This place." He nodded at the ledger on the shelf. "It is as much yours as mine." He left, the door shut behind him. Iris stood motionless for 1 full minute. Then, she flew into action. She was not the girl who had arrived, slumped on a nag. She was a woman defending her home. She ran to the door and dropped the heavy top bar into its iron brackets. She knelt and slammed the lower bar into place, a thick piece of oak that would stop a battering ram. She went to the 2 windows in the main room, her movements swift and sure. She pulled the heavy wooden shutters closed from the inside and dropped their bars. The cabin was now a small, dark fortress. But she did not stop. She lit a single lantern, its light low, and went to the back room, her room. She unbarred the small back door and slipped outside into the cold. She ran to the barn. She led the mule, not out, but into the deepest, most secure stall, the one with no windows, built against the earthen bank of the root cellar. She checked on Lark, who was gone. Aine had taken the mare. She was fast, and her hooves were quieter than the mule's. Iris returned to the cabin, but she did not go inside. She went to the shed, the one Ian had given her the key to. She unlocked it. She did not grab a weapon. She grabbed a spool of thin, black wire, the kind used for mending fences. She also took a small cloth bag from a hook, the one filled with the small, brass bells they used for the harnesses in heavy snow. She worked in the dark, her hands shaking but efficient. She moved around the perimeter of the cabin. She tied the wire to the porch posts, stringing it low. About 6 inches from the ground, across the steps. She ran another line from the corner of the house to the well. She strung a 3rd line across the path to the barn, and every few feet, she tied one of the small, brass bells. It was a trap, a frontier alarm. No man could approach the cabin in the dark without hitting the wires, without ringing the bells. Only then did she go back inside. She barred the back door. She put the shotgun on the main table. She laid out the 12 shells in a neat row, like soldiers. She blew out the lantern. She sat in the dark, in the center of her web, and she waited. Anne rode low and fast, not toward the town, but west, toward the Red Hollow. It was a wide, shallow basin of marshland, thick with cottonwoods and high reeds. A place where the water pooled and turned stagnant. It was the only place within 10 miles a group of men could make a cold camp and not be seen. He knew they would not ride straight for the ranch. They would wait. Let the moon rise, and come in the dead of night. He left Lark tied in a thicket a mile from the basin's edge. He moved the rest of the way on foot, his rifle in his hands. The moon was a thin, cold sliver, a paring knife in the sky, offering just enough light to make shadows blacker, more menacing. The air in the hollow was cold and wet. thick with the smell of decay and mud. The only sound was the high, thin ring of insects, a constant, nervous hum. He moved from tree to tree, a shadow among shadows. He had hunted wolf and mountain lion in this territory. He was hunting a different animal now, but the skills were the same. He found their trail by the creek. They had been careless, thinking themselves the hunters. He saw the print of a heavy boot, the deep marks of hobnails in the mud. He saw the tracks of 3 horses. He followed, his breath silent, his steps making no sound on the damp earth. He heard a voice, low and angry. He froze. He was close. He moved, crawling on his belly, to the edge of a thicket of reeds. He parted them with his rifle barrel. He saw them, a small, dying fire, mostly embers, shielded by a canvas sheet. 3 men. One was Clyde Marin, his arm in a dirty sling, his face pinched with pain. The second was a man he did not know, the one who had fled with the splintered face. The third was a large, heavy-shouldered man with a thick beard, who stood staring into the embers. This had to be Harlan Price. They were waiting. They had been waiting for him. It was a trap. He had walked right into it, but they did not know he was here. Not yet. He heard Clyde's whining voice. He said, "I told you. Harlan, he is just a dirt farmer. We can take him. We ride in. We take the girl. We burn the place." Harlan Price's voice was a low, heavy growl. It was the sound of rocks grinding together. He turned to Clyde. "You lost her. You had her, and you traded her. For a horse." Clyde said, "I did not know you wanted her. Harlan, I just thought." Harlan moved, fast for a big man. He grabbed Clyde by the front of his shirt with his one good hand. He said, "You do not think. I am her blood. She is my shame. She carries my name. I told you to get rid of her. Put her somewhere no one would ever find her. Not sell her to a widower farmer where she can talk." Clyde whimpered, his face pale. "I will get her back. Harlan, we will. We will get her, and we will get the ranch. It is a good ranch. That mare, she is worth money." Harlan threw him to the ground. He said, "I do not care about the ranch. I do not care about the horse. I am here for her, to finish what I should have finished years ago." The coldness of it, the raw, brutal hatred, settled in Ian's gut. This was not about money. This was about murder. He had heard enough. He could not let these men leave the hollow. He could not let them get within a mile of Iris. He raised his rifle. He took a steady breath. He had a clear view of the third man, the one with the damaged face, who was standing guard, looking the wrong way. Ian squeezed the trigger. The shot was a flat, hard crack in the damp air. The third man dropped without a sound. Clyde screamed, a high, thin sound, and dove behind a fallen log. Harlan Price roared like a bear and pulled his pistol, firing 2 quick shots into the darkness where the flash had been. The bullets ripped through the reeds, hissing past Ian's head. Ian was already moving, scrambling low and fast to his right. He would not stay in one place. He found new cover behind a thick cottonwood. He saw Harlan's muzzle flash again, and he fired at it. He heard a curse, a heavy thud. He had hit something. Clyde, from behind the log, fired his own pistol, the shot wild. Ian moved again, running, hunched over. He had to draw them deeper into the marsh. He could not let them circle back toward the ranch. As he plunged through a patch of thick brush, a white-hot pain tore across his left side. It felt like a hot poker had been laid against his ribs. He stumbled, gasping, but did not fall. He clutched his side. His hand came away wet. It was dark, but he could feel the warmth, the stickiness of it. He was hit, a graze, but it was deep. It was bleeding. He gritted his teeth. The pain was a living thing, but he pushed it down. He heard them coming after him. Clyde yelled, his voice suddenly brave. "He is hit. I heard him. He is running." Harlan's voice was a roar. "Spread out, find him." Ian pushed on, his side on fire. He was losing blood. He could feel it running down his shirt. into his pants, but he kept moving, deliberately crashing through the brush, leading them deeper and deeper into the marsh, away from the path to his home. He was drawing the wolves. He stumbled again, his vision blurring for a second. He was getting weak. He leaned against a tree, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. He heard Harlan closing in, crashing through the reeds. He heard the man's triumphant growl. Nowhere left to run. Farmer. Ian raised his rifle. He had one shot left, maybe two. He had to make it count. He saw the dark shape of Harlan burst through the trees, not 10 yards away. At the same instant, another voice, a new one, boomed through the marsh. A voice of authority. Hold in the name of the law. Harlan Price. Reverend Cole Avery. He was on horseback on a small rise, his shotgun raised, silhouetted against the thin moonlight. He must have heard the first shot from town. He had followed. Harlan spun, surprised, and fired his pistol at the new target. The shot was fast, but wild. Avery did not hesitate. The shotgun roared, a blast of fire and thunder that echoed across the hollow. Harlan Price was thrown backward, as if by an invisible, giant hand. He hit the ground and did not move. Clyde Marin, who had been creeping up behind Harlan, froze. He saw Avery turn the shotgun toward him. He threw his pistol into the mud. "Do not shoot," he screamed, his voice breaking. "I give up. I am not armed. My arm is broken. Do not shoot." Avery kept the shotgun leveled. He called out, his voice sharp. "Ian! Ian Thorne! Are you alive?" Ian let his rifle slip. He slid down the trunk of the cottonwood, leaving a dark smear. "Here!" he gasped, his voice thin. "He is hit." Avery dismounted, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. He strode past Harlan's still form. He kicked the man's pistol away. He kicked Clyde's pistol further into the mud. He kept his shotgun on Clyde, who was now weeping, a pathetic, sobbing heap. Avery found Ian. He saw the dark stain spreading across his side. Batty asked. Ian shook his head, his teeth clenched, grazed. "But it is deep." Avery nodded. He pulled a length of rope from his belt and, with quick, rough movements, tied Clyde's good hand to his feet. The violence was done. The night was suddenly, terribly quiet. The only sound was Clyde's whimpering. Avery checked Harlan. He was still. The third man was gone. Avery wasted no time. This was not a victory. It was a chore, a grim, necessary, frontier task. He hauled Ian to his feet. He said, "We have to get you back. Mara, she will know what to do." He pulled Ian onto his own horse, getting him into the saddle. He then hauled Clyde, trussed and still crying, over Lark's back, tying him down like a sack of grain. He did not spare a look for the bodies. He said, "I will send men for them at dawn." He took the reins of both horses and began the slow walk out of the marsh, leading them home. There was no triumph. The focus had already shifted, from violence to healing. Ian slumped in the saddle, clutching his side. Every step of the horse sent a fresh wave of fire through his body. But he was alive, and his only thought, the only thing that kept him upright, was the image of Iris, sitting in the dark, waiting for a voice she knew. He had to get back. He had to tell her to take the bells down. The journey back from the Red Hollow was a slow, agonizing crawl through the dark. Reverend Cole Avery led the two horses, his face a mask of grim determination. Behind him, Ian Thorne slumped in the saddle, his body held upright only by a desperate grip on the horn. His left side a sheet of wet, searing fire, on Lark. Clyde Marin was trussed and thrown, his weeping a pathetic, constant sound in the night. They did not go to the ranch. Avery knew the wound was too deep, the distance too great. He led them to the light in Mara Doone's window, the one light that always burned in Red Hollow. Iris heard them. She was sitting in the dark, the shotgun across her knees, her entire being stretched taut, listening. She heard the horses, the strange, uneven rhythm. She heard Avery call her name, his voice weary. She threw the bars from the door. The sight that met her in the moonlight almost buckled her knees. She saw Avery. She saw the weeping, bound figure of Clyde. And she saw Ian, his face as pale as ash, his shirt black with blood. She made no sound. Her terror was cold and silent. She moved, helping Avery ease Ian from the saddle. He groaned, a low, animal sound, and his legs gave way. Together, they half carried, half dragged him inside, into the small, clean room that smelled of dried herbs and lye soap. Mara Doone took one look and her face went flat. She ordered Avery to get the doctor from the next town, a woman named Dr. Agnes Finch, who rode the circuit. She said this was beyond her herbs. This was poison. She then began to shout orders at Iris. Water, hot, as hot as she could make it, cloth, clean, and the whiskey from her shelf, not for drinking, but for cleaning. Avery left Clyde tied to Mara's porch rail, a problem for later, and rode hard into the night. For 2 days, Ian did not know where he was. He was in the fire. He was in the marsh. He was screaming for Sarah, for Eli. The fever took him, a hot, dry, rattling thing. The bullet had grazed his ribs, tearing the flesh deep, and the mud and dirty water of the marsh had festered in the wound. Iris did not leave. She sat on a small stool by the cot. She did not sleep. She wiped his face with cool, wet cloths. She spooned water and thin broth between his cracked lips. She listened to him cry out for his dead wife, and her heart, which she had thought was a hard, dead stone, ached for him. Mara worked beside her, cleaning the wound, packing it with strong-smelling herbs, her face a map of worry. On the 3rd day, Dr. Agnes Finch arrived. She was a tall, thin woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it made her eyes seem sharp as needles. She carried a black leather bag. She looked at the wound, at Ian's trembling body, at the shallow breathing. She told Mara she had done good work. She said he was a strong man, but the infection was deep. It was a fight he would have to win on his own. She washed her hands and began to work, her movements precise and unforgiving. Iris, who had not eaten or slept, stood, her hand against the wall to steady herself. The room, thick with the smell of sickness and carbolic, suddenly tilted. She swayed. Dr. Finch, without looking up from Anne, spoke. "Sit down, girl, before you fall." Mara looked at Iris, her sharp eyes taking in the girl's chalk-white face, the blue shadows under her eyes. Mara said, "She has not left his side. She is worn to a thread." The doctor finished bandaging at Ian's chest. She turned, wiping her hands on a cloth. She looked at Iris, a long, clinical, assessing gaze. She was not just looking at exhaustion. She asked Iris 2 or 3 quiet, direct questions. Her voice was not unkind, just factual. Iris answered, her voice a whisper. The doctor nodded, as if confirming a calculation. She put a hand on Iris's arm. She said, "You are not just tired, child. You are carrying—" Iris stared at her. The words did not make sense. The doctor spoke plainly. "You are with child. A month, maybe 2. You are exhausted, and you are pregnant. You must sleep. You must eat. You are fighting for 2 now." Iris Vale sat down, hard, on the stool. Pregnant. The shame Harlan Price had spoken of, the idea that she was spoiled, a piece of used property, washed over her, a cold, sick wave. Mara Doone saw her face. The old woman came and put a rough hand on Iris's shoulder. She said, "Child, look at me." Iris looked up, her eyes wide with a new terror. Mara's voice was low and fierce. "There is no shame here. That man, Harlan Price, his words are filth. They are the lies of a monster. This is not that. This is life. This is the new thing." Iris looked from Mara's weathered, certain face to the man on the cot, breathing in shallow, pained gasps. Ian. This was Ian's. It was the result of their new, fragile bond, The quiet, unspoken moment after the choice had been made. When they had truly stood together, this was not shame. This was hope. The fever broke that night. It did not fade. It snapped, like a dry twig. Ayan woke near dawn, the room gray and cold. The fire in his side had cooled to a deep, throbbing ache. He was weak, but he was himself. He saw her, Iris, asleep in the chair, her head fallen forward onto the cot, her hand resting near his. He was alive. He was not in the fire. He looked at her, at the brass comb in her tangled hair. He remembered the gunshots. He remembered the blinding fear. She stirred, feeling his gaze, and her head came up. His eyes were open, clear. He tried to speak, his voice a dry rasp. She was at his side in a second, holding a cup of water to his lips. He drank. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. He had to tell her. He had to make her understand. He told her about the fear. He said he was not afraid of the guns. He was afraid of the fire. He told her when he saw Clyde raise the pistol. He did not just see the man. He saw the flames. He saw the roof collapsing. He saw Sarah. He saw Eli. And he saw her, Iris, standing on the porch. He said he was so afraid of losing again. He was afraid of the fire taking everything a second time. He had confessed his deepest wound, the ghost that had ruled him for 3 years. Iris listened, her heart aching. She had no words. There were no words for this. She took his hand, the one that had held the rifle, the one that had shaken so badly. His skin was rough, his hand large and weak. She did not speak. She acted. She placed his hand on her own stomach, flat and soft under her worn dress. She held it there, pressing it against her. He looked at her, confused. She spoke, her voice thick but steady. He could not take everything. Ayin, he did not. There is life. Here, we are here. He felt the warmth of her through the cloth. He felt the small, faint, impossible pulse of a new life. It was a new anchor. It was a new heartbeat. It was real. Thorne closed his eyes. The last of the ice around his heart, the ice the fire had left, finally cracked. He pulled his hand free, not to push her away, but to wrap his arm around her shoulders. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, which smelled of wood smoke and soap. They held each other, a long, silent, clinging embrace. It was not the passion of lovers. It was the desperate, profound relief of 2 survivors who had found shore. The small room smelled of Mara's pine salve, of soap, and of new, clean bandages. He was a solid, warm, living weight against her. He whispered into her hair, just one word, home. They stayed like that, until the sun came up, and Mara Doone opened the door and grunted in approval. Later, they talked. They talked of the child, a name. Ian, his voice stronger, suggested it. Hope, for the hope she had brought back to his house, for the hope of a future in this hard, dry land. Iris agreed. Hope Thorne. Reverend Cole Avery came to Mara's house, not as a preacher, but as the law. He sat by Ian's cot while Iris listened from the doorway. He told them Harlan Price and the other gunmen were buried, unnamed, in the marsh. Clyde Marin was in a locked wagon, on his way to the territorial prison. He would not be back. Avery had the false guardianship paper. He said he had written a full report. He had made it clear, for the official record, that Ian and Iris had acted in self-defense against an armed man attempting kidnapping, a man who held a fraudulent claim. He looked at Iris, his gaze steady. He said, "The town knows. Iris, they know what Clyde was. They know what Harlan Price was. The whispers are done. Your name is clear." When Ian was strong enough to walk, leaning on Iris's shoulder, they went home, back to the ranch. The cabin was silent, just as they had left it. The shotgun was still on the table. The bells Iris had strung were in a neat pile by the door. It was a sanctuary. Ian was too weak to work the fences, too weak to split wood. He sat on the porch, in the pale autumn sunlight. He was not idle. He had Iris bring him a block of clear, cured pine wood from the shed. He took his small carving knife, and he began to work. His hands were slow, but they were steady now. The shaking was gone. He carved a horse. It was not the crude, charred shape of Eli's toy. This one was smooth, its head high, its legs strong. A new horse, made of clean, fragrant pine. Iris had found the old cradle, Sarah's cradle, in the barn loft. She had scrubbed it clean, polished the wood until it shone. She brought it into the main room, near the hearth. When Ian finished the carving, he did not put it on the mantel. He walked inside, his steps slow but sure, and he placed the new wooden horse on the small table, right beside the cradle, the past and the future, side by side. One afternoon, when the wind was still and the sky was a deep, clear blue, Mara and Avery rode out. It was not a formal visit. They gathered, not in the house, but outside, under the great ancient cottonwood tree that grew by the dry creek bed. Its leaves were a shower of gold. Mara brought a small bowl of water from the well. She said a few words, not a prayer, but a blessing. She blessed the land, she blessed the house, she blessed Ian Thorne, and Iris Thorne, and the child, Hope Thorne. She dipped a small branch of cottonwood in the water and touched it to Ian's forehead, then to Iris's. It was a simple, quiet thing. The land was remembering their names. The family was whole. The winter that followed was hard, but it was a different kind of hardship. It was the shared, honest fight against the cold, not the poisoned stillness of fear. Ian's wound healed slowly, leaving a long, puckered scar across his ribs that he would carry forever. Iris, her body changing, moved with a new, deliberate grace. The small cabin, once a cold box of two separate griefs, became a single, warm space, thick with the smell of juniper smoke and baking bread. The cradle, scrubbed and waiting, sat by the hearth. When the ground thawed in the spring, Ian took 3 lengths of scrap pine from the woodpile. He did not go to the marsh. He walked to the farthest edge of his property, to a small rise that overlooked the hollow. Iris watched him from the porch. He worked for an hour, his movements slow and methodical. He was not building a fence. When she walked out to him, she saw what he had done. He had driven 3 crude wooden markers into the hard earth. They were not crosses. They were just stakes, memorials to the end of a thing. He took his knife and carved a single letter into each, one for Clyde, one for Harlan. He looked at the 3rd, blank piece of wood. He did not carve a name. He carved a word, fear. He stepped back, wiping his knife on his pants. He did not honor them. He was planting them. He was burying the ghosts where they could not sprout again. He looked at Iris, at the new life she carried. He said, "It is done. They will not grow here." They walked back to the house, and he did not look back. Ian's strength returned with the new grass. The barn, its roof still patched from the first storm, felt wrong. The memory of the fire, the black scar on the main rafter in the house, had a partner in the barn. It was a place of ghosts, a place where he had frozen. He did not just repair it. He began to tear the old, fire-scarred section down. He worked with a new kind of energy, a focused, driving force. He was not just surviving. He was building. He set new posts, thick as a man's chest, deep in the ground. He squared new beams, the air filling with the clean, sharp scent of fresh-cut pine. He went to Red Hollow and came back with a wagon loaded with lumber and something else, something Iris had never seen on a ranch, a large, square tin of white paint. It was an extravagance, a thing of towns and cities. Here, wood was left to weather, to turn gray and silver in the sun. He built new doors for the barn, wide and solid, and then he opened the tin. He stirred the thick, white liquid. Iris watched, her hands on her stomach, as he began to paint. He laid the color on, smooth and thick. The white was a shock against the brown dirt and the pale, dry grass. It was bright, clean, and a blinding, defiant white. She asked him, "Why paint?" Ian stopped, the brush in his hand. He looked at the white door, then at the house, then at her. He said, "I am tired of looking at scorched wood. I want to see something clean." It was a statement. The fire had been painted over. The past was sealed beneath a new coat. When he was done, the barn stood as a promise, its white doors visible for miles. Hope Thorne was born in the late summer, with Mara Doone by the bed and Ian standing by the door, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white. The baby's first cry was a thin, strong sound that cut through the old silence of the cabin, filling every corner. The rhythm of their lives shifted. It was no longer a duet of labor. It was a family. The work was still endless. Ian rose in the dark to tend the stock. Iris woke to feed the child, then strapped the cradle to her back to tend the garden. They were tired, but it was a good tiredness. It was the ache of effort, of life, of purpose. Their conversations were still short, but they were no longer about boundaries and rules. They were about the immediate, vital things. The corn is high, the well is low. She smiled today. We need flour. When they rode to town, they rode as three. Ian drove the buckboard, his shoulders set and proud. Iris sat beside him, the brass comb in her hair, holding the baby. The town of Red Hollow had changed. The story of the shootout at the Thorne Ranch had become a thing of legend. Reverend Avery's report and the fevered confession of the wounded gunman had scoured away the old rumors. The story was no longer about a widower and a bought girl. It was about a man and his wife defending their home. The whispers stopped. The stares were no longer of suspicion, but of respect. Mrs. Hiram, the storekeeper's wife, who had once stared at Iris with sharp disapproval, now came out to the wagon. She clucked at the baby and pressed a small, knitted blanket into Iris's hands. Other women, who had kept their distance, began to nod. They would stop and ask about the child. Sometimes their own children would follow the wagon, a safe distance behind, daring each other to get close to the ranch with the famous white barn doors. The isolation was over. One afternoon, Reverend Avery rode out. He was not bringing a warning. He carried 2 papers. He sat with them on the porch, Ian on the step, Iris in the rocker, nursing hope. The first paper, Avery explained, was from the territorial capital. It was an official document. The guardianship claim of Clyde Marin, he said, has been declared fraudulent and nullified. It is as if it never existed. He handed the paper to Iris. She held it, the heavy paper with its official seal. The last chain was broken. Avery cleared his throat. He had the second paper. He said, "A.N., a man with a new family needs his affairs in order." He handed the second paper to A.N., who passed it to Iris. It was a deed, a new deed for the ranch. She read the names, her finger tracing the ink, A.N. Thorne and Iris Thorne. She looked up at A.N., her eyes wide. He had done this weeks ago, in town. He had signed the papers to make her his partner, not just in work, but in the land itself. He just nodded at her, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she had always been the co-owner of the land. She was no longer a girl traded for a horse. Her name was on the deed. She was rooted. Peace settled on the ranch. It was not a lazy peace. It was a watchful peace. The West did not permit forgetting. Ian's rifle and shotgun no longer sat on the main table, ready for war. He built a high, strong rack for them over the mantel, the wood polished smooth. The guns were clean, the ammunition box full. They were tools, ready, but not ruling. On Sundays, they rested. They did not always ride to the chapel, but they honored the day. Iris would cook a chicken. Ian would sit on the porch, carving a new toy for Hope or just watching the sky. On these days, Iris would put on her one good dress, the one she had sewn from dark blue cloth. She would take the brass hair comb, the one Ayan had given her in the quiet months. She had polished it with fine ash and a soft rag, rubbing away the dullness of time and grief. The brass shone, catching the sunlight, gleaming like a piece of trapped gold. She would pin her hair up, her movements no longer rushed or fearful, but slow and sure. She would slide the comb into place. It was her one piece of adornment, her one piece of vanity. It was her badge of self-worth. Ian would watch her, his eyes soft. He saw the comb shining. He saw his wife. The years began to pass, turning over, season by season. Hope grew from a baby to a small, sturdy girl with her father's quiet eyes and her mother's resilience. She learned to feed the chickens and hunt for eggs. And then she learned to ride. Lark, the mare, was old now. Her muzzle was white, her steps slow. She was no longer the horse of a dead woman, or the price of a cruel trade. She was just Lark, a gentle, patient member of the family. Ayan lifted his daughter, small and bright, onto the horse's broad, steady back. He took the reins, and Iris stood on the porch, her hand over her mouth, watching. He led the old mare around the corral, the same corral where Iris had first touched the horse, the same corral where Ayan had first offered her the choice to leave. The small girl laughed, her hands tangled in the thick, graying mane. The horse, the living symbol of the day Iris had been sold, was now carrying the future. The circle had not just closed. It had healed. It had been made new. The sun finished its long journey, bleeding out across the western sky. It was not the angry, rust-red light of that first evening, the color of a wound. This light was gold. It was a soft, heavy gold, the color of polished brass, the color of clean wheat. It poured across the high pasture where Ayan had planted a test crop of wheat, and the wind moved through it, making the field look like a breathing, golden ocean. From the yard, a sound rose that was the soul of the ranch. It was the laugh of Hope. She was 4 years old now, a sturdy child with the quiet eyes of Ayan and the resilience of Iris. She was chasing one of the chickens, her small legs pumping, her laughter a clean, bright bell in the still air. Ayan sat on the porch step, mending a piece of harness leather. He looked up, and the deep lines around his eyes softened as he watched his daughter. He caught the eye of Iris, who stood in the cabin doorway, her hands covered in flour. He did not speak, but he smiled. It was a smile she knew well now, a small, sure lifting of his mouth that spoke of contentment. Iris leaned against the doorframe, the warmth of the cabin behind her, the golden world in front of her. The memory came to her, not as a sting, but as a distant fact, like a story read in a book, the words of Clyde Marin, spoken in the dark, sold for a horse at 19. She looked at the man on the porch, his head bent back to his work. She looked at the child, safe and laughing. She looked at the home they had built, the solid roof, the clean white barn. She finished the thought in her own mind, sold for a horse, but he had treated her like gold. She understood now what a family was. It was not the false, poisoned ink on a paper, the kind Clyde had waved. It was not the dark, brutal claim of blood, the kind Harlan Price had used as a weapon. Those were tools of control. A family was a choice. It was the choice Ayan made at the gate, to take the horse but also to shelter the human. It was her choice. When he offered her freedom, to stay. It was the two of them in the storm, soaked and terrified, saving the animals. It was his hand on her stomach, feeling the first promise of new life. It was a bond built not on paper, but on shared labor, shared danger, and a shared, quiet promise to stand together against all the hard things the world could send. Ayan had given words to this belief one evening, his voice quiet in the firelight as he watched her rock the cradle. He told her that a man cannot erase what happened, the fire, the loss, the violence. It was like the charred rafter in the house. It was a part of the structure. He said we do not forget the past. We just build something stronger on top of it." The proof of his words was there, on the high shelf above the hearth. It was the center of their home. Two objects sat side by side. One was the polished brass comb, the gift from Ian, the tool that had belonged to Sarah. It was the past, honored and given new purpose. Next to it was the new wooden horse he had carved, the one with the high, proud head, the one he made for hope. It was the future, built from clean, strong wood. The memory and the promise lived together, sharing the same space, in the same warm light. The future was not a distant, hazy dream. It was a list of chores. It was the work of tomorrow. Ian talked of widening the well, of sinking it deeper, of finding a more reliable vein of water. He had seen a new kind of seed corn at the general store, one that Hiram promised was more resistant to drought. He would plant a field of it come spring. And hope. She was growing. She needed to learn. Old Lark was too frail now for any real riding, living out her days in the sun, but her foal, a sturdy, calm colt, was strong enough. Ian said it was time to teach his daughter to truly ride, to sit a saddle, to hold the reins. The cabin grew quiet as the gold light faded from the land. The silence of the night settled in, but it was not the hollow, aching emptiness Iris had first found here. It was not the cold stillness of the grief belonging to Ian, or the terrified, breathless silence of her fear. This was a full, warm silence. It was the silence of peace, filled with the soft breathing of their child, the crackle of the fire on the hearth, and the steady, quiet presence of each other. It was the quiet of a home that had been earned. The territory was still a hard land. It was a place of drought, of wind, of sudden, brutal storms. It demanded everything a person had. It took and it broke. But Iris knew now that it also gave back. It repaid those who were strong enough to endure, who were brave enough to build, and who were good enough to keep a promise. She, who had been valued at the price of a single horse, had found her true worth. It was not a value that could be counted in dollars or traded by false papers. It was the immeasurable value of a life built with love, defended with courage, and earned with honest, hard labor. The land was harsh, but it had finally, truly, become a home. Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West Tales. Please comment below to let us all know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe, like this video, and press the hype button to support this channel and help this story be heard by more people.